Let me start by flashing up a few photos just to keep you excited about the connections between infrastructure and climate hazards, and these are more northern focused. I'm coming to you virtually from the city of Greater Sudbury, up in I guess the northern parts of the province. But what I'd like to do in the presentation is dissect, and from the topic of my presentation, dissect a little bit climate change, vulnerability, and risk assessments, and then make the connections between, at least from my perspective, the connections between that and asset management. Give an example, a project example of how I see that unfolding, and then close with a little bit about a program that we have in a course that we'll be offering on climate change and asset management. A quick word about the Institute. Only a couple of years old, but our work in climate change impacts and adaptation goes back nearly 20 years here in Sudbury. Over the years, we've worked at developing information and disseminating resources, packaging science and information, and putting it in terms and in resources that can be useful for decision makers in a variety of contexts. We've also done a lot in the lines of training, and we're doing more of that as of recent, and we've participated in different vulnerability and risk assessments around the province, for the province, and even outside of the province. We're doing some work in the Yukon and about to get some work in Alberta underway on climate change risk assessment, really trying to push towards adaptation, really trying to push towards that final stage of the process where we're looking at solutions and implementation and monitoring of not just the implementation, but the effectiveness, and also thinking about policy and how policy is driving vulnerability and risk assessments for climate change. These are the people that I get to work with. They're fabulous. They're very knowledgeable. They do all the heavy lifting. I'm just the face and the mouthpiece, and they're the ones doing all the work. Great experience and a wide variety. And they are complemented by our associates. We've adopted this model at CRI, where we've got other colleagues around the country who are part of our team, undertake small bits of work for us. These people have extraordinary experience in climate change, in risk assessment, engineering, vulnerability assessment, but also in climatology, and also in with Stephanie's addition more recently in training and in capacity building. These folks, we're very happy to have them as part of our team. A bit of context. This is the only science slide that I've got, and you heard from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services yesterday. But in the context of the challenges that we face in the impetus for what we do with respect to climate change assessment and adaptation, the graph on the top right indicating the challenges that we face, helping us understand the magnitude of what we need for adaptation. Without this, it would be challenging. We have an adaptation deficit right now, and as we continue to work towards reaching those targets for reduction of greenhouse gases, we think about what sort of adaptation would be needed into the future, and this notion of incremental adaptation versus transformational or larger scale adaptation. And I'll speak to that near the end of the presentation. On the bottom left, maybe things that some of you may not have seen yet. These are shared socioeconomic pathways, and they complement the representative concentration pathways that are shown in the top right. Those are endpoints for concentrations of GHGs in the atmosphere. Those socioeconomic pathways will be part of the next assessment report that comes out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they are you can see the variety of futures, and they include considerations of things like population growth, technology change, economic growth, and the ways that we evolve as a society around the world. Bottom left is a future that is sustainable, that is has less growth, more equality. The SSP2 in the middle of the road, SSP3 being those scenarios, those futures that make it very that have big challenges with respect to mitigation and adaptation for us. This fragmented world and resurgent nationalism. Nonetheless, the context, the backdrop for what we think about adaptation and thinking about the influence of climate change on society. Another interesting one, Chad made some great references to this, so I'm going to move pretty quickly over this, but how it affects our economies. And for those of you who work in municipalities, we often have to have this conversation about, what are the economic impacts? That lens is an important one, particularly when we think about investment in resilience solutions. So there's reports, and this is from an insurance angle, showing that the hits to GDP could be big. There's still more that we're learning about when it comes to the tipping points, but there could be some pretty significant stuff which would lead to very big economic impacts down the road. And this notion of uninsurability, the fact that we may not have mechanisms to be able to cover some of the losses that we could experience in the future, thus those costs borne by society in a larger sense. This is the one that Chad referred to specifically. There's growing evidence to show that there's good return on our adaptation investment. There's good evidence to show that we get good returns when we invest money in resilience, climate resilience, and these studies are increasing. More and more people are trying to better understand the economic side of the equation. There's other impetus too. So thinking about this from a policy perspective, and this slide's a little bit out of date. You can see some old dates on these things. It's not the date of the report. It's the fact that we're seeing more and more policy, both nationally, federally, and as well as within provinces and territories and municipalities. We're seeing this evolution of policy to reflect climate change. So it's really pushing us to pay attention to this and make sure that we're building this into our planning and our thinking and our actions. Of course, the one on the top right, maybe the most familiar and the most significant for people who are in attendance today. It's happening. So this is where I want to, I highlight the great work that's going on around the province and in other parts of the country as well. Lots of adaptation planning happening within communities, municipalities, regions, Indigenous communities. Lots of work going on in the far north to better understand how climate change is affecting people and culture. And they're likely one of their most significant assets is their winter roads. And you can imagine that in the context of a warmer winter, it makes it very difficult to establish those roads and maintain those roads in that context. And so that's a big challenge that they face. But it's also occurring in watersheds. It's also occurring in different sectors, right? It's occurring within businesses. And businesses are more and more taking stock of climate change. And so it's very encouraging, and having been in this for a while, it's great to see that there are so many groups, so many areas thinking about this and bringing it all together in their specific contexts. And so when we move towards, when you think about that happening, adaptation, the endpoint, those actions, things that we highlight as the ones that can help build resilience to climate change, look and feel different. They're different. They're different for your planning context. They're different for based on your geography. They're different based on the things that you come up with as the priorities, the priority risk areas within your community. And of course, this notion of scale, right? Some actions are small scale, the bottom left, the rain barrel to collect water, to be able to, water plants and whatever you need in times of drought, a backflow valve to prevent sewage from coming back up into your basement, homeowner level types of activities that we can undertake. And in large metropolitan centers where there's, large contributions from the heat island effect and warmer summer temperatures, extremes of temperature, green roofs to help with cooling, among the other benefits that the green roofs provide. And so you think about, when you look at, very specifically at what adaptation looks like, you can think about scale, you can think about location, and the diversity that comes with such a pervasive thing like climate change and how broad that is for all of society. It makes sense that it looks and feels different depending on our context. Over the years, there has been great progression on the development of methodical and stepwise processes to tackle climate change. Again, this big wicked problem that we face, the way that we approach it is that we have developed these frameworks to break it down into bite-sized pieces, to be able to move from step to step, to understand the risks and to ultimately prioritize and then focus some action. Now, years and years ago, there was, at least when I started, there wasn't a whole lot of these frameworks that existed. There was international standards on risk management and risk-based approaches, and really those were the precursors for what we have now. And I'll show that in a second about how we think about and tackle a wicked problem like climate change. But over the years, these generic processes have been tailored to fit different contexts, and it's interesting to see. I'll draw attention to the two on the right. The one for agriculture, very specific to looking at how two components, looking at how changing climate will affect the ability to grow certain crops in certain parts of the province. So we did this work, we developed this framework, this step-by-step framework to be able to look at how forage would be affected by changes in climate, as well as corn growth. And so within this, it's important to understand the connections between the sort of the physiological characteristics of the crop and make that connection to how climate will change. But we did this through a land suitability soil rating system. Anyway, went through, spoke to stakeholders, assessed their perceptions of risk, looked at how yields would change, and then ultimately, developed the policy information and the report to show how these things could change. So it's that framework and that process evolving from what we know about a standard process for climate change. On the bottom right, the Georgina Island First Nation, we worked with them and they developed this 7-step process that walks through the steps of a vulnerability assessment. But what was important for them was to be able to understand how climate change would affect culture in their community, and also how they could harness what the community knew about how climate was changing. So the traditional knowledge became one of the foundational pieces, and engagement of people in the community was a foundational piece. So there's more emphasis on that, step 2 or step 3 when we talk about engaging with people. And of course, some of the other assessment frameworks, there's too many of them to list here, but nonetheless, they all have these common elements. And in this next slide, I show on the left-hand side the generic risk-based approach that is within the risk management guideline for utilities developed by the Canadian Electricity Association. And when you look at those steps, you can very clearly see how they reflect or complement those of the ISO 31000 standard framework. So this risk-based approach to tackling climate change has become mainstream, is being used in communities, and is also being tailored to fit unique contexts like the one that I spoke about with agriculture, like the one that I spoke about with the Indigenous communities. Fast forward to last year in 2019, and these you can see the evolution of standard. Now we have an ISO standard for climate change. We have an ISO standard for climate change risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, and adaptation. Focus attention on those circles on the left-hand side of the screen, starting with vulnerability assessment. Right. So this here's where we understand the state of the system. How vulnerable are we right now? Because we know that climate has changed. Chad gave some of those numbers. How quickly is it coming at us? And what sort of pain are we feeling right now? But also, what ability do we have to cope? What measures do we have in place right now to be able to manage these sorts of risks? And then on the left-hand side is the forward-looking. It's the expertise from climatologists and meteorologists to help us interpret the climate data to give us a sense of frequency and probability of those hazards, or those extremes, or the slow onset events. And then the consequences. What does the literature tell us about the level of consequence? What have we experienced in the past? What are the perceptions of risk? What are the tolerances of risk of the people who live in the areas who are, in the case of infrastructure, gaining service from those assets? And then in the middle, those notions of threshold analysis. How well are the adaptation measures working right now? If we take a systems-based approach, which is the right way to do it, to think about assets as they are within a system, and the way that impacts cascade through the connections between different assets and asset classes, and the pinch points, and how we might experience what climate change looks and feels like when it affects one asset, and how that cascades through. And then of course tolerance levels and thresholds what do we know about how we're exceeding those, and at what point? And on the right-hand side, these notions of the fundamental principles that are consistent within the way that we tackle climate change risk assessments. And you could think about repeatability, because this is an iterative process, new science, new information, always wanting to reevaluate the risks at regular intervals, but also on scalability, the ability to take these processes and for others to use them within, smaller contexts or broader, larger contexts, or within sectoral contexts, wanting to make sure that there's good transparency and it's systematic and consistent with these standards. There's a lot that goes on in behind. When we conduct these risk assessments, there's a lot that is developed within those frameworks, those simple frameworks that you see. These are some examples of the way that we progress to quantify, ultimately quantify the risks. I'll just make quick mention of a couple of them on the top left. Again, the contributions of climatologists to help us interpret that forward look for projections, the extent to which the return periods are going to change for some of those extremes. On the bottom right, the levels of consequence in the consequence categories. You can see the ones that are listed there, general ones that I'm sure most of you have seen before in risk management. But again, others that are potential, social systems, and how does it affect people and communities, or cultural. If you're an Indigenous community, how does it affect the culture? The ways of life of people who live in the communities. That's very important for them. So you'd want those consequences to be covered. And again, the scales are important, and being able to distinguish between what is a 16 and a 4. That's important. On the bottom left, the same scale for adaptive capacity. What are the things that we have at our disposal to be able to manage climate risks? And are they being implemented, and how effective are they? And all of this wraps up again in the notion of quantifying these things. The consequences and the likelihood come together to map out in this heat map that many of you have likely seen before. The combination of likelihood and consequence, and then ultimately the nature of the responses that are showed in that table below to help us understand what we need to do. This is the prioritization. This is the benefit of risk assessment, is that it helps to prioritize those things that are the most important in our community, that are most at risk. And there's other ways to map this out too. This is another example from the Canadian Electricity Association, just a simple map that includes this risk tolerance threshold. And when we think about adaptation, it actually alters that our ability it increases our capacity and alters the tolerance or the coping zone that we have for extremes of climate and weather and climate. This is, mention of the Chad, I think, spoke a little bit about, and I know that David Lapp is speaking. David is formerly of Engineers Canada, was the one who led this committee. PIVC is an acronym for Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee. They developed this protocol years and years ago, a methodical, stepwise process derived from standard risk management practices, and really designed for engineers to dig into specific assets and how they might be impacted by climate change. There are many case studies, more than, I think there are 60 or 70 case studies of how the PIVC protocol has been applied to assets and infrastructure in Canada. And there is growing attention to this around the world, and demand for this sort of tool to help developing nations better understand risks associated with climate change. So I come at this from a climate change lens, and I looked over some course material that we have on climate change and asset management, and tried to make those connections between what I know about climate change risk assessment and asset management, and I came up with this table. Now, there's likely, from your perspective, you would likely be able to sharpen this a little bit and add a number of things, but let me just draw on a few that caught my attention. I don't have enough time to go through each one of them, but let me pick on a couple that I saw as the connection points between climate change risk assessment and asset management. The dynamic environment. Taking stock of the dynamic environment, and when we do our climate change risk assessments, we're thinking about socioeconomic changes, that dynamic backdrop of society. We're also thinking about mitigation, the slide that I showed at the beginning, and the extent to which climate continues to change, the magnitude of that change, that forward look from the climate models, and thresholds. In a similar fashion, I believe that within asset management, you're also giving consideration to critical thresholds for assets, thinking about population growth, growth of communities, increased levels of usage, of pressure on assets, and of course, service expectations from the public. Some overlap there. Down at the bottom, closer to the bottom, the iterative and adaptive nature of the cycle. It's really a cycle. It's an iterative approach, and we do that. We undertake that. We know that the risk assessments are meant to be repeated over time. They're meant to be inclusive of new science and inclusive of our learning about how effective the adaptation measures are that we're implementing. In a similar vein, asset management is an ongoing process. It's a continuous stock take of the assets that you have, that you are responsible for, and their state, their life expectancy, and their the levels of service that they are providing to the public. And so there's a number of things in here. The standardized process reflective of ISO standards. These are the things I think that are the connection points between our two fields of study. Also, I looked at a number of different documents related to asset management, and this whole notion of a methodical and stepwise approach and guidance is certainly evident within asset management. Let me give you this example. One of our team members, Glenn Milner, when he was with the Ontario Climate Consortium, partnered with Conservation Ontario and did this sort of high-level screening risk assessment work for infrastructure across the province. They started with taking an inventory of the assets and made some decisions about and set some criteria about which ones would be included in the assessment of flood risk. Then they went to the step of characterizing the flood hazard and doing this historical impact analysis. So looking at the different types of flooding and looking back in time to see the extent to which they were affected. There was no quantitative modeling that was done for each of the locations. Instead, they developed indicators, and they ran each of the assets through this series of screening these indicators. So it included things like proximity to surface water bodies, the surrounding soil type and drainage, the age of the infrastructure, the presence of basements. You can imagine a whole list of things that would be included in this, and then ultimately scored those using those indicators. The important pieces were the important pieces were that the outputs would mesh well into a GIS-based software system that was being used by Infrastructure Ontario. But equally important was the products that would be useful for people who manage the assets. It's important for people who manage the assets to see the information in a good form that would help them make decisions to better appreciate the risks that they face as a result of flooding. Glenn would want me to say that there were two important pieces: data is the important. That's how you get the answers, the questions answered for those indicators. But the products as well were the important pieces that helped the asset managers. Very quickly, as I get close to the end here, I want to make mention of this course that CRI is offering. This is a course on asset management and climate resilience. Many of you may know Guy Filio, who's the instructor, being offered early in March. If you're interested, visit our webpage. And this course is, in fact, one of the 4 courses that we currently have as part of our infrastructure resilience professional credentialing program, designed for engineers, developed by Engineers Canada, David Lapp and colleagues over the years. We're now the owners, the hosts of the IRP program. And we're also we've got some of these courses off the ground and are in the midst of developing 2 new ones, one on climate science and one on climate smart policy and procurement. If you are a professional engineer, you can take these courses and work towards an IRP credential. And they're also available for non-engineers where that IRP credential would not be available, but the courses are still available. Leave you with some parting messages just to summarize a little bit of what I've mentioned. It's clear that the impacts we are facing the impacts currently. The risks are significant, and it makes a lot of sense for us to be dealing with these. And we have a lot of insight in the way that we can deal with them methodically. There's great overlap, great synergies. And we advocate for the mainstreaming of climate change into existing processes, asset management being one of them. And in the context of an ever-changing environment, we do this in the backdrop of significant changes that go on within our societies. Thanks very much.